If I find in myself desires nothing in this world can satisfy, I can only conclude that I was not made for here.
AnsweringAbraham.com.
Hey guys, welcome to AnsweringAbraham.com. This is Mark Bennett again. You can call me DK. So to continue in our series, God Vindicated by Skeptics, today we're going to vindicate the doctrine of the Trinity. So to do that, I'm going to introduce my scholarly friend, a Christian apologist himself. His name is Jai Habor. Jai, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks DK. Good to be with you.
So Jai, regarding Maimonides, could you briefly describe in your own words what was his view of Unitarianism in contrast to, say, the ordinary view of Unitarianism that you would find today?
Okay, sure. So to give some background on Maimonides, he's a scholar of Judaism, was born in the 11th or 12th century, and actually he's one of the most prominent scholars of Judaism. Actually, on his gravestone, it's written, "From Moses to Moses, there arose none like Moses." And what that means is, from Moses the prophet until Moses Maimonides, there was none like Moses Maimonides. So he was actually considered to be second to Moses the prophet, which is very, very high regard of someone in Judaism. So his view of God, he held to a strong view of negative theology, and what that is a theology that doesn't allow for you to ascribe to God any positive attributes. So, for example, saying God is merciful or saying God is loving, those would be positive attributes. And Maimonides said that we actually couldn't describe God in those terms.
Why, in his perspective, do you think that he prohibited prescribing God in those terms?
From what I've read on Maimonides, I haven't read the entirety of the guide, which is where I'm getting most of my information from about this particular view.
So is that one of his premier books that he wrote in his own lifetime?
Yeah, probably the most famous book that Maimonides compiled is called the Mishnah Torah, and what that is, he was the one who compiled all of the Jewish laws, all 613 of the commandments, into one book,
Wow.
Positive and negative commandments. So he's actually that's why he's such a big scholar in Judaism.
Right.
And so one of his other works is called The Guide for the Perplexed, or The Guide to the Perplexed. And this was written to one of his more educated students, and it's available. He wanted it to be for everyone who was more advanced in their learning and education in Judaism. That's when he wrote a lot of his he answered a lot of questions regarding God's nature, pretty much how we can relate to God.
So essentially in this book, one of the essential things he does is describe the differences between a positive theology and a negative theology. Perhaps you could describe what some of those differences are from Maimonides' perspective?
Okay, sure, yeah. Again, so a positive theology would again be someone who ascribes attributes to God, like he's merciful, for example.
Right.
We use that as an attribute, a positive attribute. And Maimonides said that in his negative theology was that we cannot make any positive statements about God. Otherwise, whatever we attribute to God would actually be co-eternal with him. In other words, it would be as if God was made up of parts, and he needed all these components to actually exist. And in his mind, God doesn't really need any, components or parts to exist, or attributes.
So in Maimonides' mind, God is indivisible, completely indivisible, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so then what is negative theology? So basically, negative theology could be considered a loophole. He wants to assign attributes to God, but he has to do so in a different sense.
Yeah, he says that if you wanted to, I guess, describe God, you could do it in terms that were not positive. So you could say things like, for example, like you could say that God created the universe. You could say that, but he wouldn't actually say that God is the creator, for example. So he allowed for certain statements that you could make about God.
Well,
and he
Jay,
didn't do that as a
how does he interpret the more or less explicit statements in the Bible and even in the written Torah that do refer to God as either creator or father?
Okay, yeah, excellent question. So Maimonides in the guide, he actually, it almost looks like it's a, there's a section, almost looks like it's a vocabulary list. And what he does is he goes over all of the words that are used in the Torah of God, and he gives his take on what they mean. So for example, there's one word that we find in Genesis 1:26. Let us, it says, I'm just paraphrasing part of it where the word is found. It says, let us make man in our image. So Maimonides, for example, he'll take this word, image, and he'll define what that means. He says, well, for example, that it's not referring to like God having a literal form, but that refers to
well, it obviously refers to something intangible about God, right?
Right. So he would say, for example, that God doesn't actually have a physical image, but it could refer to something like that the way that we perceive things. For example, we might perceive things the way that God might, for example, as opposed to like, we're having the same physical shape as God.
Right.
Or something like
that. Okay. And do you know what he says about terms like creator or father? Like, why is the Torah using these terms in this way if for Maimonides they may have the connotation that we ought to say father, we ought to say creator? I mean, if this is prohibited in Maimonides' thought process, then why would his own Torah be using these words, and how does he explain that away?
Yes, so he would say that the Torah is actually speaking, that the Torah is, that the Bible is written to us in the language of men, meaning that it's written to us in a way that we can understand it, but it's not necessarily written in a way that would define God or for example, God grieving or something. He would say that that's not actually
yes, he would say the substance of that statement is different than appearance.
Yeah, exactly. So going back to the other example of being created in God's image, what he would define that as is we're being created in God's likeness in terms of intellectual perception. Not that God has a form or a body. So what he did was he kind of redefined a lot of these words in order to refute the idea that some people in his day were saying that God actually had a body.
So who was he primarily trying to refute? Was it his fellow Jews? Was it the Christians? Was it the Muslims? Or was it all of them in some sense?
Yeah, that's interesting to think about, because he doesn't exactly specify in terms of names and groups in particular. He does in certain aspects, but not exactly when he's dealing with negative theology versus positive theology. What he sort of does is he takes the approach of if the shoe fits, wear it, sort of thing. So if this description fits you, if you say these things, then this applies to you. So for example, he would be disputing with someone like Rabbi Said Gaon, who came about a century before him or so, and he would take issue with some stuff that he said, but as well he would take issue with what Trinitarian Christians were saying, with what mainstream Muslims were saying, and he would also take issue with even groups of Muslims that maybe took a form of negative theology, and he would sort of explain why he disagreed with them. But some of these things you're gonna have to read in who he's speaking about, because he's not too particular in like this group says this and this is why I reject it. He more of just gives his arguments and leaves it up for interpretation.
Okay, Jay, and according to your recollection, even though Maimonides refuses to positively assign attributes to his God, is there any sense in which maybe he makes a contradiction and does positively assert that God has some attributes? Maybe I'm thinking perhaps he said God is wisdom, or God is X, Y, Z. And if such a contradiction does exist, how would Maimonides himself reconcile this?
Yeah, so one of Maimonides, in the preface to his book, he gives a list of possible contradictions that you could find in any given literature. So he takes it as, if you find a contradiction, it could be a learning tool. For example, one example would be like, if you find two things being spoken about and they're contradicting each other, then your teacher might be giving you a simpler view, which seems to contradict the more extensive, detailed view, and you would use that as like a learning mechanism.
Right.
So that would be one thing. So yeah. So it seems that Maimonides does hold to a form of attributes, but it's not in a typical way that we'd be familiar with.
So, as an example, he would positively attribute a will to Hashem, correct?
Yeah, or will, wisdom, intellect, things like that.
But he would say that, well, he is using this semantically here on Earth, as we are restricted and limited in our semantical range. He would say this does not reflect the substance of Hashem's very essence.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
It wouldn't
So then how does, in his opinion, how does he use will, wisdom, intellect? I mean, why does he use these? I think there's about 4 of them altogether, but why does he use these 4 attributes positively? But, for example, as you said earlier, he refuses to call him a creator.
Right. So, one thing that Maimonides, I believe, to summarize why he might have given God positive attributes after he's giving us, paragraphs and paragraphs and pages of, reasons why we shouldn't believe in this. Why would he say that?
Right.
One reason is that he maybe views as God's attributes as sort of like a mirror of ways that we should imitate God in our minds. So in other words, they were more for us. Again, so it wouldn't be necessarily like saying God has intelligence. He would say that would just try to reflect. Okay, that's how we should try to act, or try to be in that sort of light, but not necessarily that God has. It's kind of confusing because, like you say, he does contradict himself, but he would make these statements for whatever purpose.
But essentially, in God's divine essence, his will, his wisdom, his intellect, and a range of other attributes are indistinguishable from his essence, and the attributes are not distinguishable on a substantial level from one another either. Is that his view? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's accurate.
Okay, thanks for confirming that. Jay, I've heard that you may have a quotation from the reference you made to earlier. Was it the Perplexed, Guide to the Perplexed? Are you able to substantiate these claims with a quotation from that book?
Rambam's, Maimonides' view of attributes. Actually, in his, as you said, just going off of what you said before, in his mind, to ascribe any sort of attribute to God, would be sort of like giving God a corporal body. It
Right.
would be idolatry, in other words, in his mind. So it would just be in his mind. It's just nonsensical to.
Well, God, for
to make these claims.
Maimonides, God is incorporeal and lacks any form. So to assign components in any shape or in any sense whatsoever would just be flat out contradictory and adulterous.
Yeah, exactly. And so for Maimonides, he just digging up the quote here. It's kind of lengthy, but I actually have a summary written by a rabbi who does he teaches on classics of medieval Judaism, so Maimonides' era, and to summarize really Maimonides' position, he's speaking for in terms of Christians and Muslims, so people who would both mainstream Muslims and obviously mainstream Christians who would give God positive attributes, and even Christians saying God
Right.
exists in persons. So Maimonides, aware of this, aware of the debates between Christians and Muslims, he says this: although the Muslim philosopher wants to distance himself from the Trinity, it is merely cosmetic, namely an alternation of theological language, but not of underlying theological doctrine. So again, as you were saying, any sort of attribute of God would equate in his mind to some form of paganism, or someone who, for example, if a Muslim wanted to say that you couldn't attribute persons to God, but you could attribute attributes to God. Maimonides just, in his mind, he just didn't grasp that idea. He just saw them as the same thing.
So do we have any proof, Jay, and is there any reference that you could think of where Maimonides describes the situation of those Unitarian Jewish or Muslims do assign positive attributes to God? Now, we've already shown that Maimonides viewed this as polytheism or flat-out paganism and logically contradictory. Do you have any quote to substantiate that, where he describes these opinions of these types of Unitarians?
Okay, yeah. So to quote from the guide for the perplexed. Here's a section here that's relevant to that. If, however, you desire to rise to a higher state, that of reflection, and truly holds to the conviction that God is one and possesses true unity, without admitting plurality or divisibility in any sense whatever, you must understand that God has no essential attribute in any form or in any sense whatever, and that the rejection of corporality implies the rejection of essential attributes. So he goes on: those who believe that God is one and that he has many attributes declare unity with their lips and assume plurality in their thoughts.
Wow.
This is like the doctrine of the Christians. So just to stop the quote here, he's describing again sort of the debate again between that he knows is going on. It's going on in his day. It was going on before him, and it goes on, as you know, it goes on after him. So he's just commenting on this debate between Christians and Muslims.
What seems to be taking place here is what he's about to do is he's about to equate some group of Unitarians who do believe you can assign essential attributes to God in some form without violating monotheism. He's about to liken them to the Christians and therefore show how both of them are polytheistic by Maimonides' standards.
Yes.
Right. Well, I'll let you read the rest of the quote.
He says, this is like the doctrine of the Christians, who say that there is one and he is three, and that three are one. Of the same character is this the doctrine of those who say that God is one, but that he has many attributes, and that he with many and that he with his attributes is one, although they deny corporality and affirm his most absolute freedom from matter, as if our object were to seek forms of expression, not subjects of belief. For belief is only possible after the apprehension of a thing. It consists in the conviction that the thing apprehended has the existence beyond the mind, in reality, exactly as is conceived in the mind. If in addition to this, we are convinced that the thing cannot be different in any way from what we believe it to be, and that no reasonable argument can be found for the rejection of this belief, or for the admission or the deviation from it, then the belief is true. Renounce desires and habits, follow your reason, and study what I am going to say in these chapters which follow on the rejection of attributes. You will then be fully convinced of what we've said. You will be of those who truly conceive the unity of God, not those who utter it with their lips, without thought, like men of whom it has been said, though thou art near in mouth and are far from their reins. Quoting from Jeremiah. Now he ends it with quote from Jeremiah. So he's obviously just to summarize what he's saying here, that it's hypocritical of people to say that God has attributes, but they wouldn't allow, for example, the same person wouldn't allow to say God exists in persons. So from Maimonides, it was just a matter of being consistent, and I think that his negative theology is the logical conclusion to his thought process. It's not necessarily that I would agree with him, but it definitely would be a logical conclusion to his thought process. That okay, if you're going to say that God can have attributes, then on what basis can you say that he can't exist in persons, as Christians say, for example?
So essentially, Maimonides seems to be a truly consistent Unitarian in which he denies God exists with any plurality whatsoever, and he alleges not only are the Trinitarians violating this type of monotheism, but he is also honest enough to allege that most of his fellow Unitarians, that's the majority of fellow Unitarians that do assign attributes to God, he's admitting, along with the Trinitarians, they are both deviating from monotheism. Would that be correct?
Yeah, exactly. And perhaps we could talk about someday why we would disagree with Maimonides and where we find disagreement even in Jewish literature. But that's another topic. But yeah, that's exactly what he was saying, that in his view, the perfect view of monotheism, or belief in the unity of God, you can't have attributes and you can't have persons in his perspective. So yeah, that's right.
So for those people who are constantly trying to say, well, there's no problem because I'm a human being, and I have arms and legs and eyes, and I'm made up of parts and components, and I'm even made up of different types of intangible things. I'm also, I could be angry, I could be merciful, so I have all kinds of different attributes. But as a human being, I can only be one person in one body. In the most case, you're one person, you're one individual, and you're one body. And you can have multiple attributes, but you can never have multiple persons or three persons who coexist simultaneously in one body. That's the standard case is human beings themselves are Unitarian. And so what do you say to those Jews or Muslims, especially Muslims, who would allege that God is the one in the same sense, that God just like a human being is one person with multiple attributes, God in a similar fashion is one individual with multiple attributes. And obviously, if a human being has 50 attributes, this doesn't make him 50 human beings. It still means he's one human being. he's one individual or person. Likewise, Jai Habor, cannot the said be same about God? Can we not say he's one individual with multiple attributes without violating monotheism? Why can't we just simply assert that God is like a human being?
Right. So, in Maimonides' view, God's attributes, if we were to give God attributes, they define our ability as humans to relate to God, and for him, that's how God relates to his creation, through these attributes. So if we were to posit attributes, that is, and so there was a rabbi before Maimonides who gave an example of sort of along the same analogy of, we can be persons with multiple attributes. That doesn't make us multiple people. And his analogy was something like, it's as if someone's worshiping fire, but they say, no, I don't actually worship the fire. I worship the heat, I worship the light, and I worship the smoke that comes out. So in effect, they're actually worshiping the fire, but those are all parts of the fire, or all attributes of the fire. And so Maimonides, he just didn't really find this compelling. He didn't really find that to be an accurate description of God, and he didn't think that gave a case for positive attributes. So yeah, that's just the answer. So for Maimonides, he just overall just didn't find it a compelling case.
Okay, well, thanks for coming on the program, Jay, and we'll surely have you as a future guest.
Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. We'll see you next time, and that's all we have time for this time, my friends. Until next time, God is even vindicated by the skeptics.